We begin our epic countdown at number 10 with the Battle of Guadalcanal, fought between August 1942 and February 1943. This campaign was the first major amphibious offensive by Allied forces against the Empire of Japan. Located in the strategic Solomon Islands, this remote mosquito-infested island quickly turned into a brutal, six-month war of attrition that would permanently reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. The main objective was a vital, partially completed Japanese airfield, later renamed Henderson Field by the Americans. U.S. Marines launched a surprise landing, seizing the airstrip with minimal initial resistance. However, the Japanese military refused to yield. They immediately launched relentless counterattacks by sea, air, and land, determined to recapture the airfield and drive the American forces back into the ocean. The environment itself was a deadly enemy for both sides. Soldiers had to fight in dense, dark tropical rainforests with suffocating humidity and knee-deep mud. Tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery spread like wildfire through the ranks, disabling thousands of men before they ever saw combat. Dangerous wildlife, crocodile attacks, and a complete lack of clean water turned daily survival into an absolute psychological nightmare. The fighting on the ground was exceptionally savage and primitive. The Japanese utilized night attacks, infiltration tactics, and terrifying bonsai charges through the dense jungle undergrowth. Fearing invisible snipers hidden high in the trees, the Americans had to defend their perimeters in absolute darkness. Every foot of jungle floor was paid for in blood, filled with brutal hand-to-hand combat using knives and bayonets. At sea, the waters surrounding the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound due to the sheer number of sunken warships. Violent naval battles lit up the night skies as both nations poured massive resources into the conflict. The skies above were a chaotic arena for constant dogfights between American Wildcats and legendary Japanese Zeros, making Guadalcanal a true meat grinder that consumed thousands of lives across all fronts. A critical aspect of the campaign was the battle for supplies, known as the Tokyo Express. Under the cover of total darkness, fast Japanese destroyers regularly rushed reinforcements and ammunition down the slot to Guadalcanal. The American forces, holding Henderson Field, dominated the daytime skies, while the Japanese controlled the waters at night, creating a deadly and exhausting cycle of around-the-clock warfare. One of the most famous ground engagements was the Battle of Edson's Ridge, a narrow coral ridge guarding the airfield. A small force of U.S. Marines defended the position against furious waves of Japanese infantry attacks. The fighting was so intense that commanders were forced to fight alongside their men with pistols, using heavy machine guns at point-blank range to stop the fanatical charges from breaking through. The Japanese strategy relied heavily on institutional courage and absolute spiritual dominance over the enemy. However, their frontal assaults against fortified American positions often resulted in catastrophic casualties. Entire regiments were completely wiped out within hours by accurate artillery and automatic weapon fire. Despite the mounting horrors, the Japanese commanders refused to change their tactical doctrine, sending more men into the slaughter. By late November, the situation for the Japanese troops on the island had become completely catastrophic. Due to the tight American naval blockade, they were starving to death in the deep jungle, earning Guadalcanal the grim nickname of Starvation Island. Thousands of soldiers died not from combat wounds, but from severe malnutrition, beriberi, and lack of medical supplies, breaking the morale of the defenders. Realizing that victory was no longer possible, the Japanese High Command executed a brilliant and secret evacuation operation in early February 1943. They successfully rescued over 10,000 surviving troops from the island right under the Americans' noses. This brought a definitive end to the brutal campaign, marking the first major strategic territorial loss for Japan and a major turning point in the Pacific. As the calendar turned to December 1942, the American forces on the island received massive fresh reinforcements. Battle-weary Marines were finally relieved by fresh U.S. Army divisions, who brought with them an overwhelming amount of heavy artillery, vehicles, and modern equipment. This influx of fresh troops allowed the Allies to transition from a stubborn, desperate defense into a relentless, coordinated offensive to clear the island. The combat shifted toward the rugged limestone hills and ridges stretching across the island's interior. The Japanese had transformed these natural high grounds into a maze of heavily camouflaged bunkers, tunnels, and hidden machine gun nests. Clearing these positions required suicidal infantry assaults, where American soldiers used flamethrowers and satchel charges at point-blank range to blast the defenders out of the rock. The psychological toll on the soldiers reached unprecedented levels during this phase. The combination of endless tropical rain, sleepless nights under constant artillery bombardment, and the horrific sight of unburied bodies rotting in the heat broke many men mentally. Military doctors reported massive outbreaks of combat fatigue and shell shock, as the thin line between civilization and primal survival completely dissolved in the mud. A critical turning point occurred during the massive naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November. In a series of violent, chaotic night engagements, the U.S. Navy suffered heavy ship losses but successfully turned back a massive Japanese fleet intended to bombard Henderson Field. This strategic naval victory effectively cut off the island's defenders from receiving any future large-scale reinforcements or heavy weaponry, with their supply lines shattered. The remaining Japanese soldiers were forced to survive on leaves, roots, and insects. Despite their skeletal, weakened physical state, they fiercely obeyed the Bushido Code, which strictly forbade surrender. Wounded men would often wait quietly with a hidden hand grenade, sacrificing their own lives to kill any approaching American medic or infantryman, making the final mop-up incredibly tense. By January 1943, the American forces launched a massive, final synchronized assault across the remaining hills. Supported by an endless rain of heavy artillery and close air support, they systematically flattened the final organized lines of Japanese defense. The Americans were stunned by the sheer determination of the starving defenders, who chose to fight to the very last bullet rather than raise a white flag of surrender. Behind the scenes, the Japanese high command realized that pouring more lives into this island meat grinder was a strategic catastrophe. Emperor Hirohito personally approved a complete operational withdrawal, in absolute secrecy, under the cover of dark, moonless nights. Fast Japanese destroyers slipped into the bays and masterfully evacuated over 10,000 skeletal, disease-ridden survivors from the island. When American scouts finally advanced into the final sector on February 9th, they found only abandoned camps, empty medical tents, and mass graves. Guadalcanal was officially secured. The true cost of this 6-month nightmare was staggering. Over 24,000 Japanese soldiers and nearly 2,000 Americans had lost their lives, making it one of the costliest campaigns in the Pacific Theater. The global strategic impact of this victory was monumental. It permanently shattered the myth of Japanese military invincibility and marked the official end of their expansion in the Pacific. From this point forward, the Empire of Japan was forced onto a permanent, desperate strategic defense, while the Allies began their relentless island-hopping campaign toward the Japanese mainland. Today, the peaceful tropical beaches of Guadalcanal are still scarred by rusty shipwrecks, half-buried helmets, and hidden bunkers. It remains an eternal monument to human endurance, primal survival, and the unimaginable horrors of jungle warfare. That concludes number 10 on our list. Join us in the next section as we transition to the freezing European front to explore number 9. At number 9 is the Battle of the Bulge, fought from December 1944 to January 1945 in the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. This massive engagement was Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble on the Western Front. launching a massive surprise offensive through the freezing, snow-covered Ardennes Mountains. Germany aimed to split the Allied armies and force a sudden peace treaty. The timing of the attack was calculated with dark brilliance. The Germans struck during a brutal winter storm when thick fog and heavy snowfall completely grounded the superior Allied air forces. Without air reconnaissance, the American lines were caught totally off guard. Over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 heavy tanks smashed through a quiet, thinly defended sector of the front. The initial German advance created a massive, deep wedge in the Allied front line, which gave the engagement its famous nickname, the Battle of the Bulge. The environment quickly became as lethal as the gunfire. Soldiers had to fight in sub-zero temperatures, freezing mud, and waist-deep snow. Thousands of men on both sides suffered from severe frostbite, trenchfoot, and hypothermia inside their icy foxholes. To create absolute chaos behind the American lines, the Germans unleashed a top-secret commando unit led by Otto Skorzeny, disguised in captured American uniforms and driving American vehicles. These English-speaking German soldiers cut communication lines, turned road signs backward, and spread massive paranoia, causing U.S. troops to suspect and question their own officers. The ultimate strategic focal point of the entire German offensive became the small historic crossroads town of Bastogne. Inside the town, the elite American 101st Airborne Division was quickly surrounded by overwhelming German forces. Cut off from all supplies and facing constant artillery barrages in the freezing cold, the American paratroopers prepared for a brutal and historic siege. The German commanders sent a formal demand for surrender to the surrounded American forces in Bastogne, warning them of total annihilation. General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single defiant word: "Nuts." This legendary response boosted the morale of the defenders, who held their frozen perimeter with incredible stubbornness, refusing to yield the vital crossroads to the German panzer divisions. While the siege of Bastogne raged, the German spearhead began to run out of steam due to a catastrophic logistical failure. Hitler's ambitious plan relied heavily on capturing Allied fuel depots along the way. However, American troops executed a brilliant scorched earth strategy, blowing up millions of gallons of fuel right before the German tanks arrived, leaving entire armored columns stranded in the snow. On December 23rd, the weather finally cleared, bringing a dramatic shift to the battlefield. The sun broke through the clouds, and the superior Allied air forces took to the skies in massive numbers. Hundreds of fighter bombers relentlessly pounded the exposed German tank columns, while supply planes dropped desperately needed ammunition, food, and medical supplies to the heroic defenders inside Bastogne. Simultaneously, General George S. Patton executed a brilliant tactical maneuver. He pivoted his entire U.S. Third Army 90 degrees north in the dead of winter, launching a massive counteroffensive. Moving with incredible speed, Patton's armored division smashed through the German encirclement on December 26th, successfully relieving the battle-weary paratroopers and breaking the back of the siege. By early January 1945, the Allied forces launched a synchronized counterattack from both the north and the south to flatten the famous bulge. The German army, exhausted, completely out of fuel, and facing overwhelming material superiority, was forced into a brutal and chaotic retreat through the frozen forest. Hitler's last great offensive had failed completely, leaving the German army permanently broken. The final weeks of the campaign turned into a brutal house-to-house clearing operation through ruined Belgian villages. Every frozen farmhouse and stone wall was transformed by the retreating Germans into a deadly defensive strongpoint. American infantrymen had to clear these positions using flamethrowers and heavy machine guns, enduring constant sniper fire and hidden booby traps left behind in the snow. The air combat during this phase reached a frantic peak. In a desperate move, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, a massive surprise attack against Allied airfields. While they destroyed hundreds of Allied planes on the ground, The operation was a tactical catastrophe for Germany, as they lost hundreds of their irreplaceable, highly trained fighter pilots within a single morning. As the German forces were systematically pushed back, the sheer scale of the human tragedy became visible. The Ardennes countryside was littered with burned-out Tiger tanks, abandoned equipment, and thousands of frozen bodies. The American forces suffered over 80,000 casualties, making this the bloodiest and largest single battle fought by the United States Army in the entire 20th century. For Germany, the losses were completely fatal. Hitler had sacrificed his final strategic reserves, elite panzer divisions, and vast amounts of fuel that could never be replaced. The eastern and western defenses of the Third Reich were left completely hollowed out, leaving the nation entirely defenseless against the massive Soviet and Allied invasions that were about to launch into the heart of Germany. The battle officially concluded in late January 1945, when the original front line was fully restored. The Allied soldiers who survived this frozen meat grinder had proven their ultimate endurance. They had withstood the absolute worst of the German war machine and the brutal winter elements, clearing the final major obstacle on the road to total victory in Europe. The horrific aftermath of the battle revealed shocking war crimes committed during the chaos. At Mamadi, an elite SS panzer unit led by Joachim Peiper brutally executed over 80 unarmed American prisoners of war in an open field. This atrocity quickly backfired on the Germans. News of the massacre spread rapidly among U.S. soldiers, fueling a fierce, uncompromising determination to fight even harder and take no prisoners. By mid-January, the extreme winter weather finally began to ease, turning the frozen snowfields into a massive sea of thick, freezing mud. This environmental shift created a logistical nightmare for the retreating German armored vehicles, which became completely stuck in the open fields, left entirely exposed without fuel or mobility. Hundreds of heavy tanks were simply abandoned by their crews and captured by Allied forces. The civilian population of the Ardennes region paid a catastrophic price during this 6-week nightmare. Whole towns and historic stone villages were completely flattened by endless artillery barrages and heavy aerial bombing. Thousands of innocent Belgian citizens lost their lives or were left completely homeless in the freezing winter, trapped in the crossfire between two massive colliding industrial war machines. The strategic failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the absolute end of any organized German hope on the Western Front. Hitler's desperate gamble had failed completely, draining the final lifeblood out of the Wehrmacht. Winston Churchill later praised the American soldiers, stating that this was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and an undeniable triumph of raw human endurance and courage. Today, the quiet forests of the Ardennes are peaceful once again, but the deep scars of foxholes and shell craters remain visible beneath the trees. It stands as an eternal monument to the men who froze and fought in the bitter cold of winter. This brings a definitive end to number 9 on our list. Join us in the next section as we cross the globe back to the Pacific Theater to explore number 8. At number 8 is the Battle of Luzon, fought from January to August 1945 on the largest island of the Philippines. This massive campaign was the largest land battle of the Pacific War, involving more troops than the United States deployed in North Africa or Italy. General Douglas MacArthur was deeply determined to fulfill his famous promise to return and liberate the Filipino people from years of brutal Japanese military occupation. The American offensive began with a colossal amphibious landing at Lingayen Gulf, where over 175,000 troops stormed the beaches within days. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, knew he could not defeat the Allies on the open beaches due to their absolute air and naval supremacy. Instead, he withdrew his massive army of 250,000 men deep into the rugged, defensive mountains. Yamashita's strategic plan was to turn the island's interior into an exhausting, long-term war of attrition. The Japanese dug a massive network of deep underground tunnels, fortified caves, and hidden artillery positions inside the dense tropical mountains. American soldiers had to advance through treacherous mountain passes under constant sniper fire, fighting for every single ridge in suffocating heat and blinding tropical downpours. While the main Japanese army held the mountains, a separate force of 20,000 Japanese naval troops disobeyed orders and barricaded themselves inside the capital city of Manila. This triggered the brutal, month-long Battle of Manila, turning the historic, beautiful metropolis into a horrific arena of urban warfare. Every single stone building, church, and home was transformed into a heavily fortified fortress that had to be cleared by hand. The fighting inside Manila quickly reached levels of savagery comparable to the worst battles of the European Eastern Front. Trapped with no escape, the Japanese forces unleashed horrific atrocities against the civilian population, brutally massacring over 100,000 innocent Filipino citizens. The historic old city of Intramuros was completely reduced to rubble by heavy American artillery as troops fought room to clear the enemy. Following the tragic destruction of Manila, the American and Filipino forces turned their full attention back to the rugged mountain ranges where Yamashita's main army was deeply entrenched. The Allies utilized their overwhelming air power, launching thousands of bombing sorties to drop napalm and heavy explosives onto the mountain ridges. Despite the endless rain of fire, the Japanese defenders remained hidden inside their deep caves, refusing to yield. The campaign transformed into a series of brutal, slow-moving siege operations along narrow mountain trails like the infamous Villa Verde Trail. Tank warfare was nearly impossible due to the steep terrain and thick mud, forcing the infantry to carry heavy equipment up the mountains on foot. Filipino guerrilla units played an invaluable role during this phase, using their expert knowledge of the jungle to ambush Japanese supply lines. As the weeks dragged on into the summer of 1945, the conditions inside the Japanese mountain strongholds became completely horrific. Cut off from all outside communication and medicine, Yamashita's troops suffered from mass starvation and tropical diseases. Thousands of soldiers died from beriberi and malaria without ever firing a shot. Yet, driven by fierce military discipline and fear of capture, they continued to fight from the shadows. The American forces had to use extreme methods to clear the remaining mountain fortifications. Special squads equipped with portable flamethrowers and heavy explosive charges systematically sealed the entrances of Japanese caves, burying the defenders alive inside the rock. Every ridge cleared was a testament to raw human endurance, as soldiers battled not only a fanatical enemy, but also the suffocating tropical heat and disease. By July 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Luzon had completely collapsed into small, isolated pockets of starving survivors deep in the northern mountains. The liberation of the island was officially declared, though thousands of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the wilderness. This colossal campaign cost the lives of over 200,000 Japanese troops and 10,000 Americans, making it a staggering, bloody milestone. The fighting in the final months shifted into the remote, dense jungles of the Sierra Madre Mountains. The remaining Japanese forces were completely disorganized, operating in small, fanatical groups that launched desperate night raids to steal food and weapons from local villages. American and Filipino troops had to carry out exhausting, dangerous, sweeping operations, checking every thick patch of jungle undergrowth for hidden ambushes. A major psychological weapon during this cleanup phase was the use of massive loudspeaker systems and dropped leaflets. Allied psychological warfare units blasted messages deep into the valleys, urging the starving Japanese soldiers to surrender and promising them fair treatment and medical aid, while a few hundred broken and emaciated soldiers crawled out of the jungle to give up. The vast majority chose to remain hidden in the dark. The human cost of this prolonged mountain warfare was amplified by a total lack of sanitation. The water sources in the mountains were heavily contaminated, leading to massive outbreaks of dysentery among the troops. American medics worked around the clock in primitive field hospitals, battling not only horrific shrapnel wounds, but also tropical fevers that quickly drained the physical strength of the frontline infantry units. By early August, the strategic landscape changed permanently when news of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan reached the Philippines. General Yamashita, still holding out with a remnant of his army in the rugged Cordillera Mountains, realized that any further resistance was completely useless. He ordered his remaining men to cease fire, preparing to step down from the mountains to face the consequences of the long and bloody campaign. The official liberation of Luzon marked the end of Japan's iron grip on the Philippine archipelago. It opened up vital airfields and naval bases that allowed the Allied forces to establish a direct, unstoppable staging ground for the planned final invasion of the Japanese mainland. The triumph on Luzon was a monumental achievement, but one that left the beautiful island permanently scarred by the immense weight of modern war. The final act of the campaign took place on September 2, 1945, the exact same day Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. General Yamashita finally emerged from his mountain stronghold with his remaining troops. He surrendered his sword to Allied officers, bringing a definitive end to the costliest land campaign the United States had ever fought in the Pacific, leaving behind a trail of complete destruction. The physical devastation of the island was nearly total, particularly in the capital city. Once known as the Pearl of the Orient, Manila was left as the second most destroyed Allied capital city of the entire war, surpassed only by Warsaw. Generations of historic Spanish architecture, universities, and government buildings were reduced to dust, requiring decades of massive international effort to rebuild from the ashes. The total casualties of the Luzon campaign remained staggeringly high. Over 200,000 Japanese soldiers died, mostly from starvation and disease in the mountains, while the Allies suffered nearly 40,000 casualties. Tragically, the highest price was paid by the civilian population, as over 100,000 innocent citizens lost their lives during the brutal month-long urban battle for Manila. General MacArthur's strategic victory on Luzon proved to the world the incredible effectiveness of joint army, navy, and guerrilla operations. It isolated Japan from its vital oil and rubber supplies in the Dutch East Indies, completely paralyzing what was left of the imperial war machine. The success of this massive campaign guaranteed that the final stepping stone to the enemy's mainland was firmly in Allied hands. Today, the mountain passes and modern streets of Luzon are peaceful, but monuments and hidden concrete bunkers still serve as silent reminders of 1945. It stands as an eternal symbol of liberation, sacrifice, and the massive scale of human endurance in the Pacific. This concludes number 8 on our list. Join us in the next section as we explore the terrifying amphibious assault of number 7. At number 7 is the Battle of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, which raged from April to June 1945. This was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Located just 300 miles from the Japanese mainland, the Allies deployed a massive armada of over 1,000 ships and 500,000 troops, preparing for a brutal campaign that everyone knew would be the final, bloodiest stepping stone before invading Japan. The initial landing on April 1st was surprisingly peaceful, as American troops stormed the beaches with almost no resistance. This was a deceptive trap. The Japanese commander, General Matsuru Ushijima, had intentionally abandoned the coast to build a massive, invisible defensive line across the southern hills of the island. He turned the natural coral ridges, deep caves, and ancient stone tombs into an impenetrable network of fortresses. The kamikaze attacks inflicted catastrophic damage on the U.S. Navy, sinking 36 ships and damaging hundreds more, making this the costliest battle in naval history. On the ground, the intense monsoon rains arrived in May, turning the entire battlefield into a vast, knee-deep swamp of thick mud, where rotting bodies and swarms of flies created a horrific psychological environment that pushed many battle-weary soldiers to madness. The absolute focal point of the Japanese defense was the Shuri Line, a massive defensive network anchored around the historic Shuri Castle. For weeks, American forces launched relentless frontal assaults against this position, sustaining horrific casualties. Every single hill, such as Sugarloaf Hill, became a legendary meat grinder where control changed hands multiple times a day in brutal, close-quarters hand-to-hand combat using bayonets and knives. By late May, the overwhelming fire superiority of the Allied artillery and naval bombardment finally breached the Shuri Line, reducing the ancient castle to complete dust. However, General Ushijima masterfully withdrew his remaining battered forces further south to the high cliffs of the island. This tactical retreat meant that the bloody campaign would drag on for several more weeks, forcing the Allies to clear every single new cave by force. The tragedy of Okinawa was amplified by the horrific fate of the civilian population. Over 100,000 innocent Okinawan citizens, trapped in the crossfire, lost their lives during the 3-month battle. Driven by extreme Japanese military propaganda that claimed American soldiers would torture them, thousands of terrified civilian families committed mass suicide by jumping off the high southern cliffs of the island into the sea. The land battle reached its final, agonizing stage on the southern ridges of the island in June 1945. The remaining Japanese soldiers, completely out of ammunition and water, launched desperate, suicidal banzai charges directly into the American machine gun positions. Refusing to face the ultimate dishonor of surrender, General Ushijima and his top officers committed ritual suicide, known as seppuku, inside their final underground command bunker. On June 22, 1945, the island of Okinawa was officially declared secured by the Allied forces. The final numbers of the campaign were staggering and deeply shocked the world. Over 110,000 Japanese soldiers and 12,000 American troops had lost their lives. This immense loss of life on a single island would directly influence the American decision to use the atomic bombs to force an immediate Japanese surrender. The final weeks of cleanup on the island turned into a dark and exhausting war of attrition. Thousands of Japanese soldiers remained hidden inside deep subterranean tunnels and natural limestone fissures, refusing to believe that their commanders had committed suicide. American infantry squads had to approach every single hole with extreme caution, as desperate defenders would often fire a final burst before detonating an explosive device inside the dark cave. To accelerate the clearing process and protect American lives, the military deployed heavy construction equipment directly to the front. Specialized armored bulldozers were used to systematically push tons of coral earth, rocks, and mud over the entrances of known Japanese underground networks. This ruthless method effectively sealed thousands of fanatical defenders alive inside their final fortresses, ending resistance without firing a single shot. The medical and psychological toll on the Allied forces reached an absolute breaking point during this final phase. The combination of witnessing non-stop kamikaze explosions at sea and the primal, savage nature of the cave fighting on land caused unprecedented psychiatric casualties. Over 26,000 soldiers were evacuated from the front line due to severe operational stress, shell shock, and complete mental collapse in the mud. A historic and tragic event occurred on June 18th, just days before the battle concluded. The Supreme American Commander, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., was personally killed by flying coral shrapnel during a Japanese artillery strike while inspecting a front-line outpost. He became the highest-ranking American military officer to be killed by enemy fire during the entire history of World War II, shocking the nation. Tragically, the high-ranking casualties were not one-sided. Just days after Buckner's death, the Japanese secondary commander, General Isamu Ch, joined Ashijima in committing ritual suicide outside their final bunker. Before his death, Ch left a written message ordering his remaining hidden troops to continue fighting a permanent guerrilla war until the very end, ensuring that sporadic violence would plague the island for months. The formal surrender ceremony on Okinawa took place on September 7, 1945, inside a ruined structure near the capital. The remaining Japanese officers officially signed the surrender documents, finally bringing a definitive end to the most brutal and prolonged amphibious campaign of the Pacific War. The Allies were left in control of a massive, strategic airbase network located right on the doorstep of the Japanese home islands. The total destruction of the island's landscape and infrastructure was nearly absolute. Beautiful, ancient tropical forests, historic towns, and centuries of Okinawan cultural heritage were completely erased by the relentless naval and land bombardments. The island was transformed into a vast, scarred wasteland of craters and mud, forcing the surviving civilian population to live in primitive refugee camps for years. The final cost of this 3-month nightmare deeply shocked the American political and military leadership in Washington. With over 12,000 Allied soldiers dead and nearly 50,000 wounded, it became clear that a direct land invasion of the Japanese mainland would result in millions of casualties. This terrifying realization was the primary factor that led President Truman to authorize the use of atomic weapons. The strategic value of Okinawa became immediately apparent during the final weeks of the war. The captured airfields allowed hundreds of American B-29 bombers and fighter escorts to launch around-the-clock airstrips directly against Japan's industrial cities. This total air dominance effectively cut off the mainland from any remaining supply lines, completely paralyzing what was left of the imperial war machine. Today, the beautiful beaches of Okinawa have healed, but the historic caves and peace monuments still serve as silent reminders of 1945. It stands as an eternal symbol of the ultimate cost of total war and the incredible weight of raw human endurance. This concludes number 7 on our list. Join us in the next section as we head back to the freezing European front to explore the underground fortresses of number 6. At number 6 is the Battle of Iwo Jima, fought from February to March 1945 on a tiny volcanic island in the Pacific. This small patch of black sand and sulfur was of immense strategic value, as it possessed vital airfields that could allow American fighter escorts to protect heavy bombers flying toward Tokyo. The United States unleashed a massive 3-day naval bombardment before sending over 70,000 Marines to storm the beaches. The initial landing on the black volcanic sand was a scene of absolute chaos. The sand was so soft and loose that vehicles became instantly stuck, and infantrymen could not dig foxholes for cover. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, ordered his men to hold their fire. He waited patiently until the beaches were completely packed with thousands of American troops and heavy equipment before unleashing a coordinated wall of death. Kuribayashi had completely abandoned traditional beach defense tactics. Instead, he had spent months turning the entire island into a massive, invisible fortress. The Japanese dug over 11 miles of deep interconnected tunnels, subterranean command rooms, and hundreds of concrete pillboxes. From these hidden positions inside the rock, they could fire upon the exposed Marines without ever being seen, turning the beaches into a horrific slaughterhouse. The ultimate geographical focal point of the island was Mount Suribachi, a massive dormant volcano dominating the southern coast. To capture this high ground, the Marines had to fight their way up steep, sulfur-choked slopes under constant, deadly mortar fire. Every single foot of advance was paid for in blood, forcing the infantry to use portable flamethrowers and heavy explosive satchel charges to clear the hidden sniper nests one by one. On February 23rd, a small squad of Marines successfully reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag, captured in a legendary photograph. This historic moment provided a massive boost to the morale of the troops across the island. However, the flag raising did not mean the battle was over. In reality, the most brutal and prolonged fighting across the northern rocky plateaus of the island was only just beginning. The fighting on the northern plateaus of the island turned into a savage war of attrition that soldiers described as fighting an invisible enemy. The landscape was a chaotic maze of jagged rocks, sulfur vents, and hidden concrete bunkers. American artillery and naval bombardments had almost no effect on the Japanese forces, who simply retreated deeper into their underground tunnel networks whenever the heavy explosions began to rain down from above. To clear these subterranean fortresses, the Marines had to rely on a brutal, point-blank tactic known as blowtorch and corkscrew. Infantrymen would approach a hidden bunker opening, wash it with liquid fire from a portable flamethrower, and then quickly throw heavy explosive charges inside to collapse the ceiling. This hazardous work required immense courage, as Japanese snipers would regularly pop out of hidden spider holes directly behind them. General Kurabayashi had strictly forbidden his men from launching wasteful, suicidal banzai charges. Instead, he ordered every single Japanese soldier to hold their position stubbornly and kill at least 10 Americans before dying themselves. This defensive doctrine turned the island into a horrific meat grinder, where the United States Marine Corps suffered more total casualties than the Japanese defenders for the first time in the war. The conditions inside the underground tunnels became an absolute living hell for the Japanese troops. Cut off from all outside supplies by the U.S. Navy, they suffered from extreme dehydration, suffocating heat from sulfur gas, and a complete lack of medical care. Thousands of wounded men died quietly in the dark from gangrene and infections. Despite the mounting horrors, the fanatical military discipline kept the defenders fighting to the end. By mid-March, after nearly a month of non-stop brutal combat, the remaining Japanese forces were compressed into a tiny pocket on the northern tip of the island. General Kurabayashi sent a final coded radio message to Tokyo, apologizing for his failure to defend the island before taking off his rank insignias and leading a final, desperate night assault. His body was never found, bringing a grim end to organized resistance on the Sare. The final stage of the battle turned into a dangerous game of clearing hidden pockets. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers remained sealed inside the massive tunnel networks, refusing to believe the island had fallen. Small American patrols had to guard the cave openings around the clock, as desperate groups of defenders would regularly emerge under the cover of total darkness to launch surprise raids on American supply depots. A dramatic and historic shift occurred on March 26th, when the remaining Japanese forces launched a final, highly organized night counterattack. Over 300 soldiers, including officers and pilots, silently slipped out of their tunnels. They bypassed the front-line outposts and fiercely attacked an American airfield, catching sleeping pilots, mechanics, and construction battalions completely off guard in a brutal melee. The chaotic airfield battle raged for hours until dawn, resulting in hand-to-hand combat inside tents and foxholes. The American forces eventually managed to rally and completely destroy the attacking Japanese force, but at a heavy cost of over 100 casualties. This final, desperate surge proved that even when thoroughly broken and starving, the Japanese military remained an incredibly dangerous and lethal opponent. The physical devastation of the island left it looking like a scarred alien landscape. Millions of artillery shells and heavy naval bombs had completely stripped the island of its sparse vegetation, leaving only smoking craters, shattered rock formations, and the toxic smell of sulfur hanging in the air. The pristine airfields were quickly repaired by American engineering battalions, who prepared them to receive heavy long-range bombers. The total casualties of the Iwo Jima campaign deeply shocked the American public, Nearly 7,000 United States Marines were killed and over 19,000 were wounded during the 5 weeks of nonstop fighting. Out of the 22,000 Japanese defenders, over 21,000 died inside their underground fortresses, as only a few hundred emaciated and wounded soldiers were captured alive. The capture of Iwo Jima immediately paid off strategically for the American air campaign against Japan. Within weeks, the repaired airfields began serving as vital emergency landing strips for massive B-29 Superfortress bombers. Over 2,000 of these heavy bombers, damaged by Japanese flak or suffering mechanical failure over Tokyo, were able to land safely on the island, saving the lives of nearly 24,000 Allied airmen. The incredible valor displayed by the United States Marines on the island was unprecedented. Admiral Chester Nimitz famously summarized the entire campaign by stating that among the Americans who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. A record number of 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for bravery during the battle, securing the island's place as one of the most sacred chapters in Marine history. Interestingly, the fighting on Iwo Jima didn't fully end when the island was declared secure. 2 Japanese soldiers, Yamakaze Kufuku and Matsudo Linsoki, managed to hide deep inside the underground tunnel networks for nearly 4 years after the war concluded, surviving on stolen canned rations left behind by the American garrison. They finally emerged and surrendered in 1949, shocked to learn that the war was over. The terrifying ratio of casualties on Iwo Jima served as a dark warning for the Allied High Command. It proved that the closer the war got to the Japanese home islands, the more fanatical and costly the defense would become. This brutal reality forced military planners to drastically recalculate the human cost of a direct amphibious invasion of Tokyo, pushing the world closer to the ultimate atomic dawn of late 1945. Today, Iwo Jima is closed to civilians, but the iconic black sands and the jagged silhouette of Mount Suribachi remain an eternal monument to the horrors of war. It stands as a timeless symbol of ultimate sacrifice and raw human endurance in the Pacific. This concludes number 6 on our list. Join us in the next section as we transition to the massive European Eastern Front to explore the tank fields of number 5. At number 5 is the Battle of Kursk, fought in July and August 1943 on the vast plains of western Russia. This monumental clash remains the largest tank battle in human history, involving over 2 million troops, 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft. Following their catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, the German High Command launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to cut off and destroy a huge Soviet salient. However, the element of surprise was completely lost. Thanks to brilliant espionage and British codebreakers, the Soviet leadership knew the exact date and location of the planned German offensive months in advance. Instead of attacking, General Georgy Zhukov masterfully turned the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified defensive zone in world history, preparing a trap made of iron and concrete to bleed the Wehrmacht dry. The Red Army constructed 8 successive defensive lines, packed with over 1 million landmines, deep anti-tank ditches, and thousands of hidden artillery positions. When the German elite panzer divisions finally launched their assault on July 5th, they did not smash through open fields. Instead, they slammed into an incredibly dense maze of fortifications, where their heavy Tiger and Panther tanks were instantly slowed down and isolated. The German strategy relied on the raw, unmatched technological superiority of their new heavy armor. However, the sheer density of the Soviet minefields and the deadly accuracy of anti-tank gun crews turned the advance into a slow, agonizing crawl. German engineers had to clear mines by hand under constant heavy mortar fire. Every single mile of progress cost the Wehrmacht thousands of irreplaceable soldiers and dozens of tanks. The air combat above the rolling fields reached an unprecedented, terrifying peak. Thousands of fighters and ground attack planes clashed in chaotic dogfights that completely filled the skies with black smoke and burning metal. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix and German Stukas relentlessly pounded the armored columns below, turning the entire region into a vast roaring furnace where the line between heaven and earth seemed to dissolve. The entire campaign reached its dramatic and violent climax on July 12th, near the small railway station of Prokhorovka Sports. This legendary engagement became the single largest clash of tanks in military history. Over 800 German and Soviet armored vehicles collided head-on at point-blank range, turning the open fields into a chaotic, screaming vortex of exploding steel, blinding black oil smoke, and burning human flesh. The battle at Prokhorovka was so claustrophobic and intense that tanks routinely rammed directly into each other to secure a kill. Soviet T-34 crews used their superior speed to close the distance, bypassing the long-range advantages of the heavy German Tiger tanks. Infantrymen leaped onto moving enemy vehicles with explosives, and the battlefield became a hellish maze of burning metal where tactical coordination completely dissolved. While the Germans suffered heavy casualties, the Soviet losses in armor were astronomically higher. Yet, the Red Army possessed an unmatched ability to rapidly replace their destroyed tanks and fallen men with fresh reserves waiting behind the lines. For Hitler, however, every lost panzer and veteran crew member was a catastrophic blow that could never be replaced, permanently breaking the offensive momentum of the Wehrmacht. Simultaneously, a critical strategic shift occurred away from the Eastern Front. Allied forces successfully launched a massive amphibious invasion of Sicily, forcing Hitler to make a desperate decision. Realizing his western flank was completely exposed, he ordered a sudden halt to Operation Citadel, commanding elite SS divisions to withdraw from Kursk and rush to Italy, effectively ending the German summer offensive. With the German forces transitioned into a chaotic retreat, the Red Army immediately launched Operation Rumyantsev, a massive, pre-planned counteroffensive. Soviet armies rolled forward like a tidal wave, liberating vital industrial cities like Belgorod and Kharkov. This marked the definitive end of the Kursk campaign, a colossal turning point that cost nearly 300,000 lives across all fronts. The German retreat across the vast Ukrainian steppes quickly turned into a brutal, systematic scorched earth campaign. Under strict orders from Berlin, the retreating Wehrmacht destroyed every bridge, railroad line, and farmhouse to slow down the pursuing Red Army. Millions of innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire as Soviet vanguard units and tank brigades pressed forward relentlessly, determined to give the enemy no time to rebuild. A major technological factor during this pursuit phase was the sudden arrival of massive Soviet artillery reserves. Known as the God of War, thousands of heavy Katyusha rocket launchers and conventional field guns lined up along the horizon. They unleashed a continuous, terrifying carpet of fire that completely flattened German rearguard positions before the Soviet infantry and armored units launched their final clearing assaults. The psychological toll on the German panzer crews reached unprecedented levels during these late summer battles. Many veteran tank commanders had been fighting non-stop for weeks without sleep, completely surrounded by a sea of burning metal. The terrifying realization that the Soviet Union could simply outproduce Germany in weapons and men shattered the morale of the troops, causing many to abandon their heavy equipment. By mid-August, the tactical focus shifted toward the strategic city of Kharkov, the industrial gateway to the region. The city had already changed hands multiple times throughout the war, leaving it a hollowed-out concrete wasteland. The fourth and final battle for Kharkov turned into a savage street-by-street meat grinder, where Soviet infantry utilized heavy flamethrowers and urban sniper tactics to clear out the final defenders. The defensive lines that Hitler had ordered to be held at all costs were completely shattered by the sheer weight of the Soviet offensive momentum. The German Center and Southern Army groups were forced to fall back hundreds of miles toward the Dnieper River. This massive strategic failure left Germany completely incapable of ever launching another major offensive on the Eastern Front, permanently sealing the fate of the war. The formal conclusion of the Kursk campaign in late August 1945 marked a monumental shift in the entire global conflict. The Red Army had not only stopped the finest panzer divisions of the Third Reich, but had completely destroyed Germany's strategic offensive capability. The initiative had passed permanently into the hands of the Soviet Union, who would now maintain a relentless, crushing advance all the way to Berlin. The physical cost of this massive clash of steel left the beautiful agricultural region of Kursk looking like a blackened, alien wasteland. Thousands of burned-out tanks, crashed airplanes, and shattered artillery pieces lay rusting in the open fields for years. The topsoil was so heavily contaminated with oil, fuel, and unexploded munitions that it took decades of dangerous demining work to restore the land for farming. The total casualties of the Kursk campaign remain among the highest in human history. The Red Army suffered over 800,000 total casualties and lost thousands of armored vehicles. Yet their massive industrial production lines quickly replaced everything. For Germany, the loss of nearly 200,000 elite soldiers and over 1,000 tanks was a fatal blow that broke the spine of the Wehrmacht. The strategic victory at Kursk proved to the Western Allies that the Soviet Union was fully capable of defeating Nazi Germany on its own. This realization added immense political and military pressure on the United States and Great Britain to accelerate their plans for a second front in Western Europe. The success of Kursk guaranteed that the final global encirclement of the Axis powers was now fully underway. Today, the quiet sunflower fields of Kursk have healed, but massive monuments and preserved armor pieces stand as silent reminders of 1943. It remains the ultimate symbol of industrial warfare, sacrifice, and the absolute limits of human endurance. This concludes number 5 on our list. Join us in the next section as we explore the freezing, desperate defense of the capital at number 4. At number 4 is the Battle of Moscow, an epic and desperate struggle fought from October 1941 to January 1942. This colossal engagement was the ultimate climax of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The German High Command launched Operation Typhoon, a massive armored offensive designed to capture the Soviet capital before the arrival of winter, believing its fall would completely collapse the nation. The initial German advance was terrifyingly fast, smashing through defensive lines and capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers in massive encirclement pockets. By mid-October, the vanguard panzer divisions were so close to Moscow that they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. This triggered widespread panic inside the capital, forcing the evacuation of government agencies and millions of civilians. However, the autumn rains arrived, turning the unpaved Russian roads into vast oceans of thick, impassable mud known as Rasputitsa. Entire German supply columns and heavy panzer divisions became completely immobilized, slowing the offensive to a brutal crawl. This logistical nightmare gave General Georgy Zhukov the vital time he needed to construct multiple massive defensive belts around the capital, mobilizing citizens to dig anti-tank ditches. By late November, the mud froze solid, allowing the German armor to move again. But it brought a new and deadly enemy, General Winter. Temperatures plummeted to a horrific -40 degrees. The German soldiers, completely unequipped for a winter campaign, suffered from severe frostbite and hypothermia inside their thin summer uniforms. Weapon lubricants froze solid, vehicle engines refused to start, and daily survival became a nightmare. Despite the freezing hell, the exhausted German infantry launched a final, desperate push toward the city limits. At the same time, Soviet intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack Russia from the east. This allowed Stalin to make a monumental decision. He secretly moved dozens of elite, fresh Siberian divisions, heavily trained and perfectly equipped for sub-zero winter warfare, directly to the defense of Moscow. On December 5, 1941, General Zhukov unleashed his secret weapon, launching a massive, unexpected counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. Supported by thousands of fresh Siberian troops on skis and the legendary T-34 tanks, the Red Army struck like a hammer. The exhausted, half-frozen German forces, caught completely without winter equipment, were utterly shattered by the sheer violence of the surprise winter assault. The Siberian soldiers moved like ghosts through the blinding snowstorms, utilizing white camouflage uniforms and specialized equipment designed for the extreme Arctic frost. They easily bypassed the rigid German strongpoints, launching devastating flank attacks and cutting off vital supply lines. The German infantrymen, unable to dig foxholes in the rock-hard frozen ground, were forced into a chaotic and desperate retreat. Hitler was completely furious about the sudden collapse of his flagship offensive. He issued a strict, uncompromising stand-fast order, forbidding any further retreat and demanding that his generals hold their positions at all costs. While this ruthless decision saved the Wehrmacht from total annihilation in the open snow, it resulted in catastrophic casualties, as thousands of soldiers froze to death inside their icy bunkers. The air combat above the frozen capital was a continuous, brutal clash of endurance. The Soviet Air Force, utilizing specialized winter lubricants and heated hangars, maintained a heavy pressure on the retreating German columns. They relentlessly bombed and strafed the exposed enemy vehicles jammed along the narrow, snow-packed highways, turning the retreat into a long, scarred trail of burning metal and death. By January 1942, the immediate threat to the Soviet capital had been completely eliminated. The Red Army had successfully pushed the battered German forces back over 100 miles from the gates of the city. This monumental campaign cost the lives of nearly 1 million soldiers across both sides, marking the first major permanent strategic defeat for Adolf Hitler's seemingly unstoppable army. The stabilization of the front line in late January 1942 did not mean the horror had ended. The campaign dissolved into a series of smaller, extremely brutal meat grinders along the Urzev salient just west of the capital. For months, the Red Army launched relentless, desperate attacks to fully destroy the remaining German positions, turning the beautiful snow-covered valleys into a chaotic landscape of craters and bodies. A major tactical factor during this freezing phase was the absolute mastery of camouflage. Soviet units utilized specialized winter outfits that made them entirely invisible against the vast snowfields. They would lie motionless in the freezing cold for hours before launching a sudden, devastating ambush on passing German supply trucks, completely paralyzing the enemy's logistic capability. The medical crisis inside the German field hospitals reached a truly catastrophic peak. With temperatures remaining far below zero, doctors had to perform surgeries and amputations without proper anesthesia or heating. Thousands of wounded men, who could have easily survived a summer injury, died quietly from shock and gangrene within minutes, breaking the long-term fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht. On the political side, the successful defense of the capital provided an incredible psychological boost to the entire Soviet Union. Stalin personally remained inside the Kremlin throughout the darkest days, demonstrating to the citizens that the leadership would never abandon the nation. This defiance unified the population, turning the industrial factories of Moscow into around-the-clock producers of weapons. The failure to capture Moscow shattered the German myth of swift, unstoppable lightning warfare forever. It forced Hitler and his high command to realize that they were now trapped in a prolonged, grueling war of industrial attrition against a massive superpower. The German army had lost its finest veteran divisions in the snow, a tragic mistake that left the nation highly vulnerable to future disasters. When the spring thaw finally arrived in April 1942, it melted the massive snowfields to reveal a landscape of unprecedented horror. The topsoil was heavily littered with frozen bodies, burned-out panzers, and abandoned equipment that had been buried under the winter blizzards. Local civilian populations had to perform the dangerous, grim task of clearing mass graves to prevent massive outbreaks of disease in the ruined villages. The total casualties of the Battle of Moscow remain among the highest ever recorded for a single campaign. The Red Army suffered over 900,000 total casualties defending their capital, while the German Wehrmacht lost over 300,000 of its finest, irreplaceable veteran soldiers. This colossal loss of life permanently altered the demographic and military landscape of the entire Eastern Front. The successful defense of Moscow also marked a monumental shift in international relations. It proved to Great Britain and the United States that the Soviet Union could withstand the absolute worst of the German war machine. This strategic realization accelerated the flow of massive Allied Lend-Lease aid, sending thousands of tanks, trucks, and aircraft directly to Russian ports to fuel the war. For the German military, the failure at Moscow triggered a massive internal crisis. Hitler lost complete faith in his traditional aristocratic generals, firing dozens of high-ranking commanders and personally taking over the supreme command of the army. This centralization of power would directly lead to catastrophic tactical mistakes in the future, as political fanaticism replaced professional strategy. Today, the bustling modern streets of Moscow are peaceful, but monumental defense barriers and eternal flames stand as silent reminders of 1941. It remains the ultimate symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the absolute limits of a superpower's endurance. This concludes number 4 on our list. Join us in the next section as we transition to the final, apocalyptic urban collapse of number 3. Taking the bronze medal at number 3 is the Battle of Berlin, the final catastrophic chapter of World War II in Europe. Fought from April to May 1945, the Soviet Red Army launched a colossal offensive involving over 2.5 million troops, 40,000 artillery pieces, and 6,000 tanks. Their ultimate objective was to smash through the final German defenses, capture the capital, and completely destroy Adolf Hitler's regime. The operation began with a massive, terrifying artillery bombardment along the Oder River, where thousands of Soviet guns completely lit up the night sky. The German defenders, outnumbered and heavily outgunned, held out stubbornly at the Silo Heights, inflicting heavy casualties on the advancing Soviet forces. However, the sheer weight of the Red Army's momentum was unstoppable, and within days, they fully encircled the flaming city. Inside Berlin, the defensive situation was completely desperate. With most veteran Wehrmacht divisions already destroyed, the defense of the capital was left to a chaotic mix of regular soldiers, fanatical SS units, elderly Volkssturm militia, and teenage Hitler youth children. Adolf Hitler refused to flee, remaining hidden deep inside his underground bunker beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery, issuing useless orders to imaginary armies. The combat quickly turned into a brutal street-by-street and house-by-house nightmare. Soviet tanks had to advance through narrow, rubble-choked avenues where they were heavily ambushed at point-blank range by hidden teenage soldiers armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The Red Army responded with overwhelming brutality, using heavy artillery and direct rocket fire to completely flatten every building that showed any resistance. The civilian population suffered unimaginable horrors trapped in the crossfire. Millions of innocent women, children, and elderly citizens hid inside dark, freezing subway tunnels and basements without water, electricity, or food. Above them, thousands of heavy bombs and millions of artillery shells continuously rained down, transforming the historic, beautiful metropolis into a chaotic, smoking wasteland of ash and death. The absolute symbolic and strategic focal point of the Soviet offensive became the Reichstag building. This heavily fortified structure was defended with fanatical determination by several hundred elite SS troops, who turned every corridor, basement room, and staircase into a deadly defensive stronghold. Soviet infantrymen had to fight their way through pitch-black rooms using submachine guns and hand grenades in intense hand-to-hand combat. On April 30th, 1945, realizing that total defeat was entirely inevitable, Adolf Hitler committed suicide inside his underground bunker. Just hours later, Soviet soldiers successfully reached the roof of the burning Reichstag and proudly raised the red Soviet flag over the ruined city. Captured in one of the most iconic photographs of 20th century history, this dramatic event signaled the definitive end of the Nazi regime. Despite the death of Hitler, sporadic and violent resistance continued to rage across the ruined city blocks for 2 more days. Small groups of fanatical SS troops, fearing brutal Soviet retribution and execution, launched desperate breakout attempts to cross the western bridges and surrender to the American forces instead. Most of these chaotic attempts ended in bloody tragedy under heavy Soviet machine gun fire. On May 2, 1945, the military commander of Berlin, General Helmuth Weidling, officially ordered all remaining German forces to immediately cease fire and surrender. He broadcasted a final message urging the teenage Hitler youth and regular soldiers to stop the useless slaughter. Over 130,000 exhausted, traumatized German defenders laid down their weapons, stepping out into the shattered streets. The total human cost of the Battle of Berlin was staggeringly high. The Red Army suffered over 80,000 dead and nearly 300,000 wounded during the final 2 weeks of non-stop urban combat. The German military and civilian deaths inside the city limits exceeded 100,000. This catastrophic campaign permanently crushed the Third Reich, marking the definitive conclusion of the war in Europe. The official surrender of the city garrison did not instantly bring peace to the traumatized population. In the immediate aftermath, Berlin became a scene of absolute chaos and lawlessness as millions of victorious Soviet soldiers flooded the ruined streets. Having endured years of brutal German occupation on their own homeland, many frontline Red Army units unleashed a devastating wave of mass looting and fierce retribution against civilians. The humanitarian crisis inside the shattered capital reached unprecedented levels during May 1945, with the entire sewage system destroyed, electricity gone, and water main lines broken. Deadly epidemics of typhus and dysentery threatened to wipe out the survivors. Soviet military commanders had to rapidly set up primitive field kitchens and distribute emergency rations to prevent millions of citizens from dying of starvation. Behind the scenes, elite Allied and Soviet intelligence teams rushed into the ruins on top-secret extraction missions. They hunted for hidden files, advanced scientific research, and rocket blueprints left behind by the Nazi regime. Operation Paperclip and similar Soviet programs targeted German rocket scientists and nuclear physicists, triggering a secret race that would directly launch the space race of the Cold War era. On May 8, 1945, the definitive unconditional surrender of all German forces was officially signed in Berlin. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the documents in front of Soviet and Allied generals, marking the formal end of World War II on the European continent. This historic moment triggered massive, ecstatic victory celebrations in London, Paris, Moscow, and New York, known globally as Victory in Europe Day. The political consequences of the battle permanently altered the global map. Berlin was divided into 4 separate occupation sectors controlled by the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. This complex arrangement turned the ruined capital into the ultimate geopolitical flashpoint of the 20th century, setting the stage for the Berlin blockade and the eventual construction of the Berlin Wall. The massive cleanup of the ruined capital required an extraordinary human effort. With most working-age German men either dead or held in Soviet prison camps, the task fell completely to the women of Berlin, famously known as the Trümmerfrauen, or rubble women, working in long human chains. They cleared millions of tons of shattered bricks and concrete by hand, systematically sorting and cleaning them to rebuild their homes. The total cost of the physical destruction left Berlin looking like a hollowed-out concrete skeleton. Generations of historic European architecture, world-famous museums, and government institutions were completely reduced to vast fields of smoking rubble. Over 80% of the city center was entirely flattened by the relentless combined weight of Allied strategic bombing campaigns and the final, crushing Soviet artillery fire. The fate of the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners captured during the battle was incredibly dark. Most were immediately marched east into the vast network of Soviet Gulag labor camps. Forced to work under brutal conditions with minimal food and heavy winter frost, nearly half of these captured soldiers died in captivity, never returning home to see their families in the newly divided post-war Germany. The battle for Berlin proved to the world the absolute futility of political fanaticism when facing overwhelming industrial and military superiority. The Red Army's victory was a monumental achievement of planning and raw endurance, secured by the blood of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It successfully erased one of the most brutal regimes in world history, closing the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Today, the vibrant modern metropolis of Berlin has healed, but bullet holes on old stone walls and massive peace memorials stand as silent reminders of 1945. It remains an eternal symbol of complete collapse, ultimate sacrifice, and the rebuilding of human civilization. This concludes number 3 on our list. Join us in the next section as we explore the massive Eastern Front offensive of number 2. Winning the silver medal at number 2 is Operation Borgression, a colossal Soviet summer offensive fought from June to August 1944 across Belarus and Poland. Named after a historic Russian general, this massive campaign was the most devastating single military defeat in all of German history. The Red Army unleashed over 2 million troops, 6,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft to completely annihilate Nazi Germany's premier army group center. The strategic brilliance of the operation relied heavily on a massive, highly coordinated deception campaign known as Maskirovka. The Soviet High Command masterfully convinced Adolf Hitler that their main summer assault would launch further south in Ukraine. Believing the fake intelligence, the Germans moved their finest elite panzer divisions away from Belarus, leaving the central sector of the Eastern Front tragically hollowed out and blind. On June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years to the day after Germany invaded Russia, the trap snapped shut with terrifying violence. Thousands of heavy Katyusha rocket launchers and conventional artillery pieces unleashed a continuous carpet of fire that completely flattened the German front line. Soviet tank armies and mechanized corps rolled forward like an unstoppable tidal wave, smashing through the broken defenses within a matter of hours. The German tactical doctrine quickly collapsed under the sheer speed of the Soviet advance. Hitler issued his traditional uncompromising Festerplatz or fortress town orders, strictly forbidding his generals from retreating and demanding they hold vital junctions to the last man. This stubborn political strategy backfired catastrophically, as the fast-moving Soviet armor easily bypassed these towns, completely surrounding entire German divisions. Within days, over 28 German divisions were trapped inside massive chaotic encirclement pockets around cities like Vitebsk and Bobruisk. The environments became an absolute meat grinder under constant Soviet air and artillery strikes. German soldiers tried to make desperate breakout attempts through dense tropical swamps and burning forests, but most were systematically cut down by accurate Soviet machine gun fire and partisan ambushes. The scale of the destruction inside the Bobrusk pocket was unprecedented. Over 70,000 German soldiers were completely wiped out or captured in less than 3 days. The Luftwaffe was entirely missing from the skies, leaving the retreating columns at the absolute mercy of Soviet ground attack planes. The roads of Belarus became a scarred wasteland filled with miles of burning military trucks, dead horses, and shattered heavy artillery. By early July, the Soviet mechanized spearheads achieved their ultimate objective, capturing the capital city of Minsk and trapping over 100,000 more German troops. Hitler's Central Front had completely evaporated, creating a massive 400-mile gap in the German lines. The Red Army pressed forward relentlessly, moving so fast that their main challenge became rushing fuel and supplies to their own racing tank armies. To prove the absolute magnitude of their strategic victory to a skeptical world, Joseph Stalin ordered a massive propaganda event in Moscow. On July 17, 1944, over 57,000 captured German soldiers, including dozens of high-ranking generals, were marched through the crowded streets of the Soviet capital. This historic march demonstrated to the global public that Germany's military spine on the Eastern Front was broken. The psychological impact on the remaining Wehrmacht forces was devastating. Veteran soldiers realized they were being completely outmaneuvered by a highly sophisticated and modernized Red Army that possessed total material dominance. The myth of German tactical superiority was completely dead. Panic and chaos spread through the rearguard units as Soviet cavalry and armored vanguard groups suddenly emerged from the forests deep behind their lines. By late July, the momentum of Operation Bagration pushed the front line all the way to the gates of Warsaw and the borders of East Prussia. The Red Army had advanced over 300 miles in just 5 weeks, liberating vast territories and completely shifting the geopolitical balance of power in Europe. This monumental offensive cost the lives of nearly 500,000 soldiers, securing its place as an absolute masterpiece of strategic warfare. The campaign now entered a phase of clearing out isolated pocket remnants deep inside the dense Belarusian forests. Thousands of bypassed German soldiers organized into desperate groups, attempting to march under the cover of total darkness toward their western lines. The Soviet command deployed specialized security divisions and highly mobile cavalry units to hunt down these fugitives, turning the beautiful wilderness into a silent, lethal arena of constant ambushes. A major strategic factor behind the lightning speed of the offensive was the massive, hidden network of Soviet partisans, operating behind enemy lines for years. These irregular resistance fighters launched thousands of coordinated sabotage attacks on the exact night the operation began. They blew up railroad tracks, destroyed bridges, and cut communication cables, completely paralyzing the German military's ability to move reinforcements. The humanitarian crisis inside the liberated territories revealed the true, dark nature of the years of German occupation. Soviet troops discovered hundreds of burned villages, destroyed towns, and horrific mass graves left behind by the retreating forces. The sheer emotional weight of these discoveries fueled an intense, uncompromising rage among the advancing Red Army soldiers, driving them to push even harder toward the heart of Germany. For the German High Command, the loss of Army Group Center created a catastrophic tactical vacuum that forced them to make desperate decisions. They were forced to rapidly strip vital divisions away from the Western Front, where the Allies had recently landed in Normandy, and rush them east. This massive relocation of forces left the Western defenses dangerously hollowed out, accelerating the collapse of the Third Reich on both fronts. By early August, the sheer physical exhaustion of the Soviet troops and the overextension of their long supply lines finally brought the massive advance to a temporary halt. The Red Army had achieved a monumental victory, having systematically destroyed a force larger than the entire German army deployment in Western Europe. The strategic landscape of the war was altered permanently, placing the Allies on an unyielding path to victory. The final weeks of the campaign focused heavily on securing vital bridgeheads across the Vistula River in Poland. These strategic water crossings were defended with absolute fanaticism by newly formed German reserves, who launched furious counterattacks to prevent a direct Soviet gateway into Germany. The fighting in the mud along the riverbanks turned into a lethal deadlock, requiring massive artillery support to firmly hold the newly won Allied positions. The total physical destruction left behind by Operation Bagration transformed the landscape of Belarus into a scarred wasteland. Hundreds of historic towns, railway networks, and industrial centers were completely leveled by the relentless combined weight of artillery and airstrikes. It took decades of painful post-war labor, rebuilding, and dangerous demining operations to restore the region's agricultural and civil life from the ashes. The total casualties of this massive summer offensive remain among the most shocking statistics in the history of global warfare. The German Wehrmacht suffered over 400,000 total casualties, including nearly 30 high-ranking generals killed or captured. The Red Army paid an equally staggering price of nearly 800,000 casualties, demonstrating the incredible, bloody sacrifice required to break the spine of the Axis powers. Strategically, the triumph of Operation Bagration proved to the world the absolute mastery of Soviet deep battle doctrine and mechanical coordination. It successfully isolated the remaining German forces in the Baltic states, creating the massive Courland pocket that remained trapped until the end of the war. The success of this operation guaranteed that the final, crushing advance into the heart of the Third Reich was entirely unstoppable. The thick forests and quiet rivers of Belarus have healed, but massive concrete memorials and tank monuments stand as silent reminders of 1944. It remains the ultimate symbol of complete military annihilation, sacrifice, and the sheer scale of modern industrial war. This concludes number 2 on our list. Join us in the final section as we explore the apocalyptic, historic urban meat grinder of number 1. Taking the ultimate number 1 spot as the bloodiest and most important battle in human history is the Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943. This apocalyptic clash on the banks of the Volga River was the decisive turning point of World War II. Adolf Hitler launched a massive offensive to capture the city bearing Joseph Stalin's name, believing its fall would completely crush Soviet economic survival and morale. The German offensive began with the terrifying, massive aerial bombardment by the Luftwaffe, which dropped thousands of tons of explosives onto the metropolis. Within a single day, the beautiful industrial city of Stalingrad was completely transformed into a burning, hollowed-out concrete wasteland of smoking rubble. However, instead of forcing a quick surrender, the destruction inadvertently created the perfect defensive maze for the Red Army. When the elite German Sixth Army entered the ruined city, the combat quickly devolved into a primitive and savage form of urban warfare that Saxe-Lauset soldiers grimly nicknamed Rattenkrieg, or Rat Warfare. The traditional speed and mobility of the Blitzkrieg were completely useless among the jagged brick piles. Every single street, collapsed cellar, sewer pipe, and shattered factory floor had to be cleared by hand in brutal close combat. The strategic focal points of the city became legendary meat grinders, such as the Mamayev Kurgan Hill and the massive Red October steel factory. Control of these ruined sectors changed hands multiple times a day in claustrophobic face-to-face battles using knives, bayonets, and sharpened entrenching shovels. Snipers operated from the shadows of hollowed walls, paralyzing troop movements and turning the ruins into a lethal arena. General Vasily Chukov, commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, implemented a brilliant and desperate tactic known as hugging the enemy. He ordered his soldiers to maintain their defensive positions just yards away from the German lines. This extreme close proximity prevented the Luftwaffe and heavy German artillery from bombarding the Soviet trenches, as any large-scale strike would inevitably kill their own frontline German infantry. By November 1942, the German forces had successfully captured over 90% of the ruined city, compressing the stubborn Soviet defenders into a few narrow strips of land along the freezing Volga River. The situation for the Red Army was completely critical, but behind the scenes, General Georgy Zhukov was masterfully assembling a massive secret strike force of over 1 million fresh troops and thousands of tanks in the surrounding steppes. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, a brilliant and massive double-envelopment offensive. The Red Army deliberately bypassed the elite German units inside the city, striking instead at the poorly equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces guarding the vulnerable German flanks. Smashed by overwhelming armor, the flank defenses collapsed completely within days, trapping the entire German Sixth Army inside a massive pocket. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers were suddenly completely surrounded inside the Stalingrad pocket, famously known as the Kessel, or Cauldron. Hitler strictly forbade his supreme commander, General Friedrich Paulus, from attempting a tactical breakout. Instead, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to supply the entire trapped army by air, a completely impossible task that failed catastrophically due to bad winter weather and Soviet anti-aircraft fire. As the brutal Russian winter arrived, temperatures plummeted below -30 degrees, turning the cauldron into a frozen wasteland of starvation and death. The trapped German soldiers, completely out of ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies, were forced to survive on frozen horse meat and melted snow. Thousands of men froze to death inside their icy foxholes, completely abandoned by their high command as the Red Army systematically tightened the noose. In January 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, a massive, final synchronized offensive to crush the remaining resistance inside the pocket. Soviet artillery unleashed a continuous, terrifying carpet of fire that systematically flattened the final German strongpoints and airfields, left entirely without any hope of rescue or supplies. The remaining Axis forces were compressed back into the ruined city center, preparing for the inevitable end. The final days of January 1943 turned into an agonizing cleanup operation inside the frozen ruins. Bypassed German groups barricaded themselves inside shattered basements, fighting to their last bullets out of pure fear of Soviet captivity. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, realizing the absolute futility of further sacrifice, ignored Hitler's strict suicide commands and officially surrendered his remaining central forces from his underground headquarters. On February 2, 1943, the final pocket of German resistance in the northern industrial district collapsed, bringing a definitive end to the 5-month campaign. Over 91,000 exhausted, frostbitten, and starving Axis soldiers laid down their weapons, stepping out into the shattered streets as prisoners. This monumental victory triggered immense waves of pride across the entire Soviet Union, proving that the Wehrmacht was no longer invincible. The humanitarian catastrophe discovered inside the liberated ruins was completely unprecedented. Thousands of unburied bodies lay frozen solid under the thick snow mounds, requiring months of dangerous cleanup work by local civilian brigades. The city's entire civilian population, which had exceeded 400,000 before the invasion, was reduced to just a few thousand traumatized survivors living inside primitive mud huts and caves. The long-term fate of the captured German prisoners was exceptionally dark. Marched into the freezing depths of the Soviet Union toward distant Siberian labor camps. Over half of the weak and malnourished soldiers died from typhus and exhaustion within the first few weeks. Out of the 91,000 men who surrendered at Stalingrad, Only 6,000 would ever survive the harsh decades of captivity to return home to Germany. The strategic impact of this monumental victory permanently altered the entire global balance of power. Germany had lost an entire elite field army, a catastrophic blow that broke the back of the Wehrmacht and drained the nation of its finest military reserves. From this historic turning point forward, Nazi Germany was forced onto a permanent, desperate strategic retreat, while the Red Army began its long, unyielding advance toward Berlin. The structural destruction of the city was nearly total, leaving behind a smoking skeleton of brick and iron. Famous factories like the Red October plant and the tractor works, which had been the scenes of such fierce hand-to-hand fighting, were completely reduced to vast fields of tangled metal. It required a massive, decades-long national effort and thousands of workers to fully rebuild the city from its ashes after the war concluded. The total casualties of the Stalingrad campaign remain the most shocking and terrifying statistics in all of human military history. Across both sides, nearly 2 million soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the 5 months of non-stop apocalyptic warfare. This immense sacrifice broke the spine of the Axis forces, permanently shifting the moral and industrial balance of the war in favor of the Allied nations. The victory at Stalingrad also echoed globally, sending massive waves of hope through occupied Europe. It proved to the underground resistance movements and the Western Allies that the Nazi war machine could not only be stopped, but thoroughly annihilated in the field. This triumph guaranteed that the final global encirclement of Germany was now entirely unstoppable, setting the world on an unyielding path toward liberation. Today the city has been renamed Volgograd, but the scarred topsoil and the massive historic memorial complex stand as silent, eternal reminders of 1942. It remains the ultimate symbol of industrial slaughter, raw sacrifice, and the absolute maximum limits of a nation's human endurance. Stalingrad stands unmatched at number 1 on our list, a dark monument to the true and devastating cost of total global war. From the dense jungles of Guadalcanal to the apocalyptic ruins of Stalingrad, these 10 legendary campaigns redefined the boundaries of raw human endurance and tragedy. They proved that true strategic victory is bought with the blood of millions. Which of these historic battles do you think was the most terrifying? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching our countdown. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic documentaries. See you next time.